When I opened the front door that Tuesday evening and saw my daughter-in-law, Jessica, standing there with that familiar smirk plastered across her face, I should have known she was planning something cruel. She had this way of looking at me like I was some relic from a bygone era. Like everything I did was outdated and embarrassing. But I was excited because my son Marcus had finally agreed to bring his wife and their friends over for dinner. After 3 years of marriage, this was only the second time Jessica had set foot in my house. I had spent the entire day preparing what I considered my masterpiece meal. Slow-cooked oxtails that had been simmering for hours until the meat fell off the bone. Perfectly seasoned collard greens with smoked turkey necks. Cornbread made from scratch using my grandmother's recipe that had been passed down for 4 generations. Mac and cheese, so rich and creamy, it could make you weep with joy. Sweet potato pie with a crust so flaky, it practically melted in your mouth. This wasn't just food. This was love on a plate, tradition wrapped in flavor, history served with pride. Marcus walked in first, giving me that warm hug I had missed so much. Behind him came Jessica, followed by 3 couples I had never met before. They looked like they had stepped out of some fancy magazine, all designer clothes and perfect hair. I could immediately sense the judgment radiating from them as they took in my modest living room with its well-worn furniture and family photos covering every available surface. The introductions were awkward. Jessica barely looked at me as she mumbled the names of her friends. There was Brad and Ashley, some tech executives who kept checking their phones. Then came Cameron and Sophia, who worked in marketing and spoke in that pretentious way that made everything sound like a business pitch. Finally, there was Tyler and Madison, who owned some trendy restaurant downtown that I had never heard of. I invited everyone to sit down while I finished setting the table. I had used my best china, the set my late husband James had bought me for our 20th wedding anniversary. Each plate was a treasure. Each glass held memories of better times when our house was full of laughter and love. I wanted everything to be perfect because I knew how important Jessica's approval was to Marcus, and despite everything, I wanted her to like me. When I called everyone to the dining room, I watched their faces carefully as they took in the spread I had prepared. My heart swelled with pride as I explained each dish, sharing the stories behind the recipes, the love that had gone into every ingredient. I talked about how my grandmother had taught me to season the greens, how my mother had shown me the secret to perfect cornbread, how James had always said my oxtails were better than his own mother's. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica exchanged a look with Ashley, and I saw something pass between them that made my stomach clench with anxiety. But I pushed forward, serving generous portions to everyone, making sure each plate was a work of art. I wanted them to taste not just the food, but the heritage, the tradition, the love that had shaped every recipe. Marcus took his first bite and closed his eyes with appreciation. This was the food he had grown up eating, the comfort that had sustained him through childhood scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. But when I looked around the table, the other faces told a different story. Brad was pushing food around his plate without actually eating. Sophia was making little faces like she was tasting something unpleasant. Cameron was openly grimacing. Then Jessica spoke, and her words cut through me like a knife. She said the food was too heavy, too greasy, too old-fashioned. She complained that everything was over-seasoned, that the mac and cheese was too rich, that the cornbread was too dense. With each criticism, I felt smaller, older, more out of place in my own home. But the worst was yet to come. As I watched in growing horror, Jessica stood up and began collecting plates from around the table. Not empty plates, but plates still full of food that people had barely touched. She was gathering up hours of my work, generations of tradition, love made manifest in every carefully prepared dish. I thought maybe she was trying to help clear the table, though something about her expression made me uneasy. Instead of taking the plates to the kitchen to be properly stored, Jessica walked directly to my trash can. In front of everyone, in front of Marcus, in front of me, she scraped every single plate into the garbage. The oxtails that had simmered all day, the greens I had carefully cleaned, leaf by leaf, the cornbread made with my grandmother's recipe, the mac and cheese that had taken me hours to perfect. Everything went into the trash with ceremonial cruelty. The sound of the plates scraping was like nails on a chalkboard, but worse was the laughter that followed. Jessica's friends found her performance hilarious. They were actually laughing as my life's work, my heritage, my love letter to my family disappeared into the garbage. Ashley made some comment about how they would need to stop for real food on the way home. Brad said something about how he couldn't believe people actually ate food like this. The cruelty was breathtaking in its completeness. Marcus sat frozen at the table, his face a mask of confusion and embarrassment. I waited for him to say something, to defend me, to tell his wife that her behavior was unacceptable, but he just sat there, paralyzed by the social dynamics he didn't know how to navigate. My son, the boy I had raised to be respectful and kind, said nothing as his wife humiliated his mother in her own home. I stood there, watching this scene unfold, feeling like I was outside my own body. The woman who had spent 40 years perfecting these recipes, who had fed her family with love and pride, who had welcomed these strangers into her home with open arms, was being treated like her very existence was a joke. The laughter echoed in my ears as Jessica made one final comment about how she hoped I wouldn't be offended, but the food was just not up to their standards. The evening ended quickly after that. The couples made their excuses and left, still chuckling about the dinner disaster they had just witnessed. Marcus mumbled an apology that felt hollow and rehearsed before following his wife out the door. I was left alone with a dining room full of empty chairs, a kitchen full of dirty pots, and a trash can full of my dreams. I sat in my living room that night, still wearing the dress I had picked out specially for the occasion, and cried harder than I had since James died. It wasn't just about the food, though that hurt enough. It was about the disrespect, the casual cruelty, the way they had dismissed not just my cooking, but my entire way of life. It was about Marcus choosing silence over defending his mother. It was about feeling invisible in my own home. But as I sat there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. The tears stopped flowing, and in their place came something harder, colder, more determined. I thought about Jessica's laughter as she scraped my food into the trash. I thought about her friends snickering at my expense. I thought about the way they had looked at me like I was nothing, nobody, just some old woman whose feelings didn't matter. What they didn't know, what Marcus had apparently never bothered to tell his wife, was that I wasn't just some home cook who puttered around in her kitchen. Before I retired, I had been one of the most sought-after caterers in the city. I had cooked for mayors and governors, for celebrities and business leaders, for people who appreciated real food prepared with skill and love. My client list read like a who's who of the city's elite, and my reputation was built on decades of excellence. I had given up that life when James got sick, choosing to care for him instead of pursuing my career. After he died, I had been content to cook just for family, to let my professional reputation fade into memory. But sitting there in my living room, surrounded by the echoes of Jessica's cruelty, I realized that maybe it was time to remind the world who I really was. The next morning, I made a phone call that would change everything. The number I dialed belonged to Margaret Chen, the event coordinator for the city's most prestigious catering company. Margaret and I had worked together for 15 years before my retirement, and she had always told me that if I ever wanted to come back, there would be a place for me. I had never imagined I would take her up on that offer, but desperation has a way of opening doors you thought were permanently closed. Margaret's voice was warm with surprise when she heard from me. After the usual pleasantries about health and family, I cut straight to the point. I told her I was ready to come back, that I needed to work again, that sitting at home had become unbearable. What I didn't tell her was about the humiliation from the night before, about the sound of my grandmother's recipes hitting the bottom of a trash can, about the laughter that still rang in my ears. The timing, as it turned out, was perfect. The city's annual charity gala was just 3 days away, and their head caterer had come down with food poisoning. They needed someone who could step in immediately, someone with experience handling high-profile events, someone who could manage a team and deliver excellence under pressure. Margaret didn't hesitate. She knew what I was capable of, even if I had forgotten it myself. I spent the next morning at the catering company's headquarters, going over menus and meeting the team I would be supervising. It felt strange at first, slipping back into that professional mindset after years of domestic tranquility. But as I reviewed the guest list and planned the service schedule, something inside me began to awaken. This wasn't just about proving myself to Jessica and her friends. This was about remembering who I had always been, underneath the grief and loneliness. The gala was being held at the Grand Ballroom downtown, the same venue where I had catered the mayor's inaugural dinner 5 years earlier. As I walked through the space during setup, memories came flooding back. The precision required to serve 300 people simultaneously. The ballet of servers moving through the crowd with perfect timing. The satisfaction of watching distinguished guests savor food that had been prepared with absolute attention to detail. I threw myself into the preparation with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. Every sauce had to be perfect. Every garnish had to be placed with artistic precision. Every member of my team had to understand that we were not just serving food. We were creating an experience that these guests would remember for years to come. The standards I set were exacting, because anything less would have been a betrayal of everything I had built my reputation on. The menu we had designed was sophisticated yet accessible. Herb-crusted beef, tenderloin with red wine reduction, pan-seared salmon with lemon butter sauce, roasted vegetable medley that showcased the best of the season's produce. Everything was prepared using techniques I had perfected over decades, recipes that had been refined through countless events and satisfied customers. This was food that spoke of professionalism, of expertise, of someone who understood that cooking was both art and science. As the event day arrived, I felt a familiar electricity in the air. The controlled chaos of a professional kitchen operating at peak efficiency. The synchronized movements of servers preparing to deliver impeccable service. The knowledge that in a few hours, every detail of our preparation would be tested in front of the city's most discerning palates. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I had requested to work the floor myself that evening, something I rarely did in my previous catering career. Usually, the head caterer stayed in the kitchen, orchestrating from behind the scenes. But something told me I needed to be out there among the guests, to see their faces as they experienced what real cooking looked like. Margaret raised an eyebrow at my request, but didn't question it. She trusted my instincts, even if she didn't understand my motivation. The servers' uniforms were crisp, white shirts with black bow ties and aprons. Professional, elegant, appropriate for an event of this caliber. As I adjusted my own apron in the mirror before service began, I caught a glimpse of myself and felt a surge of pride. This was who I really was. Not the lonely widow whose food got thrown in the trash, but a professional who had earned respect through skill and dedication. The guests began arriving at 7, and I watched from the kitchen as the ballroom filled with the city's elite. Politicians and business leaders mingled with artists and philanthropists. The mayor was there, of course, along with several city council members I recognized from previous events. The conversation was animated, the atmosphere sophisticated, the kind of gathering where reputations were made and deals were struck over perfectly prepared canapés. Service began precisely at 8, and immediately I could see that my team was performing flawlessly. Plates went out hot and beautifully presented. Guests were receiving their meals with the kind of seamless efficiency that only comes from years of experience and meticulous planning. Comments drifted back to the kitchen about the exceptional quality of the food, the professional service, the attention to every detail. I was carrying a tray of the herb-crusted beef tenderloin to table 12 when I saw her. Jessica was seated at a corner table, but she wasn't wearing the designer dress I had expected. Instead, she was wearing a server's uniform, identical to mine, complete with a white shirt, black bow tie, and crisp apron. Her hair was pulled back in the same professional style required of all service staff, and she was carrying a tray with the nervous uncertainty of someone who had never done this kind of work before. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating. The woman who had thrown my food in the trash just 3 days earlier was now serving food at the same event where I was the head caterer. The irony was so perfect, so completely unexpected, that I had to stop walking and steady myself against a nearby wall. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor that was both cruel and beautiful. I watched as Jessica struggled with her tray, clearly overwhelmed by the pace and precision required for this level of service. She nearly dropped a plate of salmon, caught it at the last second, and looked around nervously to see if anyone had noticed. Her movements were clumsy, where mine were fluid, uncertain where mine were confident. She was clearly desperate for this work, probably taking whatever jobs she could find to make ends meet. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. Jessica needed this job. She was depending on this evening's work to pay her bills, to keep food on her own table, to maintain whatever small measure of financial stability she had managed to scrape together. The woman who had treated my cooking like garbage was now serving someone else's food for minimum wage, plus tips, hoping to earn enough to get by. I adjusted my own tray and walked purposefully toward her section of the dining room. My movements were those of someone who belonged in this environment, who had earned the right to be here through years of professional excellence. As I approached table 12, I could see Jessica out of the corner of my eye, still struggling with her service, still looking like she didn't quite know what she was doing. The guests at table 12 were complimentary about their meals, praising the tenderloin's perfect seasoning and the elegant presentation. These were people who had eaten at the finest restaurants in the city, who knew the difference between good food and exceptional food. Their appreciation validated everything I had poured into this evening's preparation, everything I had remembered about why I had loved this work in the first place. As I finished serving table 12, I noticed that Jessica had finally managed to deliver her meals without incident. She was standing near the service station, looking exhausted and overwhelmed, clearly counting the minutes until her shift would end. Her designer confidence was nowhere to be seen. In its place was the humility that comes from doing work that requires you to serve others, to put their comfort before your own pride. I walked over to the service station, my own tray now empty, and stood directly in front of her. For the first time since that terrible dinner 3 nights ago, Jessica and I were face to face. But this time, the power dynamic was completely reversed. I was the professional in charge, and she was the struggling worker hoping to make it through her shift without making any more mistakes. The recognition dawned slowly in Jessica's eyes, like watching someone emerge from a fog. At first, there was just confusion as she tried to place my face in this unexpected context. Then came the shock as she realized that the woman she had humiliated in her own kitchen was now standing before her in a position of authority, wearing the same uniform, but carrying herself with the confidence of someone who belonged here. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The woman who had been so quick with cutting remarks about my cooking now seemed completely at a loss for what to say. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how this was possible, how the old lady whose food she had scraped into the trash was now the head caterer at one of the city's most prestigious events. I let the silence stretch between us, savoring the moment. This wasn't about gloating, though I would be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction in seeing her discomfort. This was about truth finally revealing itself, about the natural order of things asserting itself after being temporarily disrupted by cruelty and ignorance. Other servers moved around us in their practiced dance of professional service. But Jessica and I existed in our own bubble of recognition and reckoning. She was sweating slightly despite the air conditioning, and I could see her hands trembling as she gripped her empty tray. The confidence that had allowed her to dismiss my life's work so casually had evaporated completely. I reached over to the service station and picked up a fresh plate of the herb-crusted beef tenderloin, the same cut I had been serving all evening to rave reviews. The presentation was flawless, the aroma rich and inviting, the kind of dish that would make any food lover's mouth water. This was professional cooking at its finest, the result of decades of experience and unwavering standards. Without breaking eye contact, I extended the plate toward Jessica. My voice was calm, professional, carrying just the right note of authority that came naturally after years of managing kitchen staff and coordinating complex events. The words I had been waiting 3 days to say finally found their voice. "Careful with this one," I said, my tone perfectly measured. "That's the same kind of food you said was garbage." The plate seemed to hang in the air between us, a symbol of everything that had transpired and everything that was now being corrected. Jessica's face went through a series of expressions, confusion giving way to understanding, understanding giving way to mortification. She reached for the plate with hands that were visibly shaking now, the weight of her own words from 3 nights ago settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. I watched as she struggled to process what was happening. The woman who had thrown my grandmother's recipes in the trash was now being handed professionally prepared food by the very person she had humiliated. The irony was so complete, so perfectly circular, that it felt like justice had been served on a silver platter. But I wasn't finished yet. Reaching into my apron pocket, I pulled out a crisp $5 bill. The money felt significant in my fingers, not because of its monetary value, but because of what it represented. In the service industry, tips are how we show appreciation for good work, how we acknowledge effort and express gratitude for service rendered. I held the bill out toward Jessica, making sure she could see exactly what it was. Her eyes fixed on the money with a mixture of need and humiliation. She needed that tip, needed every dollar she could earn from this evening's work. But taking it from me, after everything that had happened, would be an acknowledgement of how completely our positions had reversed. "Here's your tip," I said, the words carrying layers of meaning that went far beyond their surface simplicity. I always believe in rewarding good service. The laughter that escaped my lips was soft but unmistakable, not cruel, not vindictive, but filled with the kind of satisfaction that comes when the universe finally balances its books. It was the laughter of someone who had been underestimated and had lived to prove just how wrong that estimation had been. Jessica took the money and the plate with movements that seemed robotic, automatic. Her training as a server, limited though it was, kicked in enough for her to mumble a barely audible "thank you," but her eyes told the real story. They were filled with the dawning realization that she had made a terrible miscalculation about who I was and what I was capable of. I turned away from her then, my point made, my moment of vindication complete. There was work to do, other tables to serve, other guests who would appreciate the quality and craftsmanship that went into every dish we prepared. The evening was far from over, and I had a reputation to maintain. As I moved through the ballroom with renewed energy, I could feel Jessica's eyes following me. She was watching as I interacted effortlessly with the mayor, as city council members complimented me on the exceptional quality of the meal, as business leaders asked for my card because they wanted to hire me for their own events. This was my world, had always been my world, and I had simply allowed myself to forget it for a while. The guests were effusive in their praise throughout the evening. The beef was perfectly seasoned. The salmon flaked beautifully. The vegetables were cooked to exactly the right texture. More than one person commented that this was the best catered meal they had ever experienced at a city event. Their appreciation washed over me like warm sunshine, reminding me why I had fallen in love with this profession in the first place. Margaret found me during a brief lull in service, her face glowing with satisfaction. The evening was going flawlessly, she told me. The mayor had already asked who was responsible for the exceptional food, and several other clients were inquiring about hiring our company for their own events. Word was spreading through the room about the quality of the cuisine, and by extension, about my return to the catering world. I glanced across the room and saw Jessica struggling with a heavy tray, her movements still uncertain and clumsy. She was clearly exhausted, overwhelmed by the pace and precision required for this level of service. Other servers moved around her with practiced ease, while she fumbled with plates and glasses, counting the minutes until her shift would mercifully end. The contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. While I was receiving compliments and building new business relationships, she was barely managing to keep up with the basic requirements of her temporary job. While I was being recognized as a professional at the top of my field, she was struggling to prove she could handle entry-level service work. But perhaps the most telling difference was in how we carried ourselves. I moved through the room with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had earned her place through skill and experience. Jessica moved like someone who was counting the minutes until she could escape. Someone who was only there out of desperate necessity. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about Marcus and wondering if he knew where his wife was tonight. Did he know she was working as a server to make ends meet? Did he understand that their financial situation had become so precarious that she needed to take whatever work she could find? The woman who had been so quick to judge my cooking was now dependent on the food service industry for her survival. The main course service concluded without incident, and we began preparing for dessert. The chocolate torte we were serving had been one of my signature dishes back in my active catering days, and I had insisted on preparing it myself for this evening. It was rich, decadent, and absolutely perfect. The kind of dessert that would end the meal on a high note and leave guests talking about the experience for weeks to come. As I watched the dessert plates go out to the dining room, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with professional pride. This was what I was capable of when I applied my full skills and experience. This was the level of excellence that had built my reputation over decades of hard work and dedication. The evening was winding down now, but the impact of what had transpired would last much longer. Jessica had learned something important about judgment and humility, about the dangers of dismissing people based on superficial impressions. She had discovered that the woman whose cooking she had mocked was actually a master of her craft, someone who commanded respect in professional kitchens across the city. More importantly, I had rediscovered something about myself that I had almost forgotten. I was not just a lonely widow whose best days were behind her. I was a skilled professional with decades of experience and a reputation built on excellence. The humiliation I had experienced 3 nights ago had been the catalyst I needed to remember who I really was and what I was truly capable of achieving. The guests began filtering out around 11, their conversations animated with praise for the exceptional meal they had just experienced. Business cards were exchanged. Future events were discussed, and more than one person made sure to get Margaret's contact information so they could request me specifically for their next catering need. As the cleanup began, I watched Jessica finish her shift with obvious relief. She was clearly exhausted, her uniform wrinkled and stained from the evening's work. The $5 tip I had given her was probably one of many small gratuities she had collected throughout the night, each one a necessity rather than a luxury. She avoided looking in my direction as she prepared to leave, but I could sense her awareness of my presence. The woman who had laughed as she threw my food away now understood exactly what kind of food she had been so cavalier about discarding. The cooking she had dismissed as garbage was actually the work of someone who could command top dollar in the city's most exclusive venues. As I finished overseeing the final cleanup of the kitchen, Margaret approached me with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. She had been in the catering business for 25 years, and she knew excellence when she saw it. The evening had been flawless, she told me. Better than any event they had catered in the past 2 years. The mayor himself had asked for my name, wanting to ensure I would be handling his upcoming campaign fundraiser dinner. 3 city council members had requested my contact information for their own private events. The validation felt like cool water on a burn that had been festering for 3 days. Each compliment, each request for my services, each acknowledgement of my skill was a balm to the wound that Jessica's cruelty had left on my soul. But more than that, it was proof of something I had known deep down, but had allowed myself to forget. I was good at this. I was more than good. I was exceptional. Margaret handed me an envelope with my payment for the evening, but the money was secondary to what I had gained. I had reclaimed my professional identity, remembered my worth, and in the process had shown Jessica exactly who she had been so quick to dismiss. The woman who had treated my life's work like refuse was now working in the same industry where I was considered royalty. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Jessica's face when she realized who I was, the confusion, the shock, the dawning understanding that she had made a terrible mistake in judging me so harshly. She had seen me as just some old woman puttering around in her kitchen, making heavy, outdated food that sophisticated people wouldn't touch. Now she knew I was someone who could command respect from the city's elite, someone whose food was praised and sought after by people who had eaten at the finest establishments in the world. The next morning brought something I hadn't experienced in years. My phone started ringing before 8 o'clock, and it didn't stop. Word had spread through the city's social circles about the exceptional catering at the previous night's gala. Margaret had been fielding calls since 7 in the morning from people who wanted to hire me specifically for their events. The mayor's office had called to confirm my availability for his campaign dinner. A prominent law firm wanted me to handle their annual partner retreat. The art museum was interested in having me cater their upcoming gala. For the first time since James died, I felt truly alive again. The grief and loneliness that had consumed me for so long were still there, but they were no longer the only things defining my existence. I was a professional again, a woman with skills and talents that were valued and appreciated. I had purpose beyond just existing, from one day to the next. But perhaps the sweetest part of my vindication came 3 days later when Marcus called me. His voice was different somehow, smaller, more uncertain than I had heard it in years. He wanted to talk, he said. He needed to apologize for what had happened at dinner, and he had some things he needed to tell me about Jessica and their situation. We met at a small cafe downtown, the same place where I used to take him for hot chocolate when he was a boy. He looked tired, older than his 32 years, with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying burdens you're not sure how to handle. As he sat across from me, fidgeting with his coffee cup, I could see the little boy he used to be struggling with the man he had become. The story he told me broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Jessica had been lying to him about their financial situation for months. She had been fired from her marketing job 6 weeks earlier for poor performance and had been too proud to tell him. Instead, she had been taking whatever temporary work she could find while pretending to still be employed. The server job at the gala had been one of many desperate attempts to bring in income without having to admit the truth. Their marriage was falling apart, Marcus confessed. The pressure of their financial problems, combined with Jessica's inability to be honest about their situation, had created a toxic environment where blame and resentment poisoned every conversation. She had taken out her frustration on me that night because I represented everything she felt she was failing to provide for their household. My cooking, my hospitality, my obvious contentment with my simple life had made her feel inadequate in ways she couldn't articulate. None of this excused what she had done. Marcus was quick to clarify. Throwing my food away had been cruel and unnecessary, a deliberate act of humiliation that he should have stopped immediately. He had been too shocked to react in the moment, too caught off guard by the viciousness of her behavior to find his voice. But his silence had made him complicit in her cruelty, and he knew it. As I listened to him struggle through his explanation, I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication that was hard to process. Part of me was heartbroken to learn that my son's marriage was in trouble, that he was carrying burdens he felt he couldn't share with me. But another part of me felt validated in a way that went beyond professional recognition. Jessica's behavior toward me hadn't been about my cooking at all. It had been about her own failures, her own insecurities, her own desperate attempts to maintain a facade of success that was crumbling around her. The woman who had laughed as she scraped my grandmother's recipes into the trash had been drowning in her own problems. The sophisticated friends who had found my food so amusing were probably unaware of Jessica's real situation, just as they had been unaware of my professional background. The entire evening had been built on false premises and hidden truths, with my humiliation serving as the entertainment for people who didn't even know they were watching someone's life fall apart. But what struck me most about Marcus's confession was what it revealed about the nature of respect and recognition. Jessica had dismissed me because she saw me as irrelevant, as someone whose opinions and feelings didn't matter. She had treated me like a relic from a bygone era because she assumed I had nothing to offer her modern, sophisticated world. The discovery that I was actually a respected professional in the very industry where she was now struggling to find work had shattered those assumptions completely. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. The woman who had treated my cooking like garbage was now dependent on the food service industry for survival. The sophisticated urbanite who had mocked my traditional recipes was now serving food prepared by people like me to people who appreciated real skill and craftsmanship. The person who had used my hospitality as entertainment for her friends was now working in a profession that required her to prioritize other people's comfort over her own pride. Marcus asked if I could forgive Jessica, if there was any way we could move past what had happened and try to rebuild some kind of relationship. The question hung in the air between us, like smoke from a fire that was still burning. Forgiveness was complicated, I told him. I could forgive the cruelty because I understood now that it had come from a place of desperation and self-hatred rather than genuine malice. But forgetting was different. Some lessons needed to be remembered. What I couldn't forgive, I explained, was the assumption that my life, my work, my heritage was somehow less valuable than theirs. The casual dismissal of everything I had built and achieved. The laughter that had accompanied the destruction of my offering. The way they had treated me like I was invisible in my own home. These things cut deeper than simple rudeness or even deliberate cruelty. They spoke to a fundamental lack of respect for who I was as a person. The catering jobs kept coming throughout the following weeks. My calendar filled up with events that would have made my younger self dizzy with excitement. Corporate functions, political fundraisers, private parties for the city's elite. Each event was an opportunity to demonstrate my skills, to prove that the woman Jessica had dismissed was actually someone whose talents were highly sought after. The money was good, better than I had expected for someone returning to the workforce after such a long absence. But more than the financial security, I treasured the respect and recognition that came with each successful event. Clients praised my attention to detail, my ability to handle complex logistics, my skill in creating menus that impressed even the most sophisticated palates. I was building a reputation all over again, but this time with the wisdom and confidence that come from having survived loss and humiliation. Margaret offered me a permanent position as their head caterer, with a salary that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. The offer was tempting, but I found myself hesitating. After years of retirement The idea of returning to full-time work felt overwhelming, but more than that, I was enjoying the freedom to choose my projects, to work when I wanted to work, and rest when I needed to rest. Instead, I proposed a different arrangement. I would work as an independent contractor, taking on the projects that interested me while maintaining control over my schedule and creative decisions. Margaret agreed immediately, knowing that my reputation was already bringing new clients to her company. It was the perfect solution for someone who wanted to work on her own terms. The first month of my return to catering brought 6 major events and more inquiries than I could handle. Word was spreading through the city's social networks about the exceptional quality of my work. Food critics who attended events I catered made subtle references in their reviews to the outstanding cuisine. Society columnists mentioned the impressive catering at galas and fundraisers. My name was becoming associated with excellence once again. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Tyler and Madison, the couple who owned the trendy restaurant downtown and had been among Jessica's dinner guests that terrible night. They wanted to hire me to cater their restaurant's 5th anniversary party, an exclusive event for food industry professionals and local celebrities. They had no idea I was the same woman whose cooking they had mocked just weeks earlier. The conversation was surreal. Madison gushed about how they had heard amazing things about my work, how everyone was talking about the incredible caterer who had emerged seemingly out of nowhere to become the most sought-after name in the city's event scene. She explained that they only wanted to work with the best, that their restaurant's reputation depended on associating with other professionals who shared their commitment to excellence. I accepted the job, of course. How could I resist the opportunity to show Tyler and Madison exactly what kind of food they had dismissed so cavalierly in my dining room? The menu I designed for their anniversary party was sophisticated yet accessible, innovative yet grounded in solid technique. Every dish was a masterpiece of flavor and presentation, the kind of food that would make food industry professionals take notice and remember. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The same people who had laughed as Jessica threw my food away were now paying me handsomely to prepare food for their most important professional event. They were trusting their reputation to the very person they had treated as a joke just weeks earlier. The reversal of fortune was so complete, so perfectly circular, that it felt like the universe was correcting a cosmic imbalance. As I planned their menu and coordinated the logistics for their anniversary party, I thought about Jessica and wondered how she was managing her own struggles. Marcus had mentioned that she was still looking for steady employment, still taking temporary service jobs to make ends meet. The woman who had been so confident in her superiority was now learning the hard lessons that come with genuine adversity. There was a part of me that felt sorry for her, despite everything that had happened. Desperation makes people do cruel things, and I understood now that her behavior toward me had been driven by her own fears and insecurities rather than genuine malice. But understanding her motivations didn't erase the impact of her actions or the lessons that needed to be learned from them. The anniversary party for Tyler and Madison's restaurant was scheduled for the following Saturday evening. As the date approached, I found myself looking forward to it with an anticipation that went beyond professional pride. This would be my opportunity to demonstrate once and for all that the woman they had dismissed was actually someone whose skills commanded respect from the very people they most wanted to impress. I spent days perfecting every element of the menu, testing recipes and refining presentations until each dish was absolutely flawless. The appetizers were elegant and surprising. Combinations of flavors and textures that would intrigue even jaded food industry palates. The main courses showcased both technical skill and creative vision, the kind of cooking that separated true professionals from talented amateurs. The desserts were works of art that would leave guests talking about the meal for months to come. The evening of the party, I arrived at the restaurant 2 hours early to oversee the setup and brief the serving staff. The venue was beautiful, decorated with understated elegance that complemented rather than competed with the food. The guest list read like a directory of the city's culinary elite, food critics and restaurant owners, celebrity chefs, and Food Network personalities. This was exactly the kind of crowd that would appreciate exceptional cooking and remember the person responsible for it. As the guests began arriving, I watched from the kitchen with the same mixture of nerves and excitement I had felt before every important event throughout my career. This was what I lived for. The moment when all the preparation and planning would be tested in front of people who knew the difference between good food and great food. There was nowhere to hide behind excuses or explanations. The food would speak for itself. The first round of appetizers went out at 7:30, and within minutes I could hear the murmur of appreciation that every caterer hopes for. Guests were complimenting the flavors, the presentation, the creativity of the combinations. Food critics were taking notes. Restaurant owners were asking servers about preparation techniques. The evening was off to exactly the kind of start that builds reputations and creates lasting impressions. Tyler and Madison moved through the crowd, beaming with pride as their guests praised the exceptional catering. They made sure to mention to everyone that they had discovered this amazing new caterer who was taking the city by storm, someone whose work was already becoming legendary among those in the know. They had no idea they were describing the same woman whose food they had found so laughable just a few weeks earlier. The main course service went flawlessly, each plate a perfect example of technical skill combined with artistic vision. The beef was cooked to precise temperatures, the seafood was fresh and perfectly seasoned. The vegetarian options were creative and satisfying. Guest after guest complimented the complexity of flavors, the beautiful presentations, the obvious skill of whoever had prepared such exceptional food. As the evening progressed, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from the humiliation in my own dining room to the recognition and respect I was receiving from the city's most discerning food professionals. The path had been painful, but it had led me back to who I really was, underneath all the grief and loneliness that had consumed me for so long. The dessert course was the final test, and I had saved my most impressive creation for last, a chocolate soufflé that required precise timing and perfect technique, served with a raspberry coulis and gold leaf garnish that made each plate look like a piece of edible art. The reaction from the guests was everything I could have hoped for. Gasps of appreciation, followed by the kind of reverent silence that comes when people are experiencing something truly exceptional. Tyler found me in the kitchen as the evening was winding down, his face glowing with satisfaction and gratitude. The party had been a complete success, he told me. Guests were already asking him who had done the catering, wanting to book me for their own events. Food critics were planning to mention the exceptional cuisine in their upcoming reviews. The evening had exceeded even his highest expectations. As he thanked me profusely for my work, I couldn't help but wonder if he remembered meeting me before, if there was any recognition in his eyes of the woman whose cooking he had dismissed so casually in my own home. But there was nothing, no flicker of memory or acknowledgement. I was simply the talented caterer who had made his anniversary party a resounding success, someone whose skills he now respected and admired. The disconnect was both amusing and enlightening. The same people who had found my cooking laughable when it was served in my modest dining room were now praising identical techniques and flavors when they were presented in a professional context. The only thing that had changed was the setting and their expectations. My skills, my recipes, my attention to detail had remained exactly the same. As I packed up my equipment and prepared to leave that night, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in just a few short weeks. The woman who had been humiliated in her own home was now the most sought-after caterer in the city. The cooking that had been dismissed as garbage was now being praised by food industry professionals as exceptional. The person who had been treated as invisible was now someone whose talent commanded respect and recognition. But perhaps the most important change was internal. I had rediscovered my own worth, remembered my own capabilities, reclaimed my professional identity after years of allowing it to fade into memory. The cruel laughter that had accompanied the destruction of my dinner had awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long. I was no longer just existing from one day to the next. I was living again, creating again, contributing something meaningful to the world again. The success of Tyler and Madison's anniversary party opened even more doors. Within a week, I had received inquiries from 3 more restaurants wanting to book me for their special events. 2 political campaigns asked about my availability for fundraising dinners. A prominent wedding planner wanted to add me to her list of preferred caterers for high-end ceremonies. My calendar was filling up months in advance, and I found myself in the enviable position of being able to choose which projects I wanted to take on. The financial security was wonderful, but even better was the respect and recognition that came with each successful event. I was building something again, creating a legacy that would outlast any temporary humiliation or cruelty. Marcus called me again the following Tuesday, and this time his voice carried a desperation I had never heard before. "Mom," he said, "Jessica wants to apologize to you personally. She's been crying for days since she found out about your catering business. She knows she made a terrible mistake, and she's begging for a chance to make things right." I listened to my son plead his wife's case, but something inside me had fundamentally shifted. The woman who used to drop everything to help her family, who used to put everyone else's needs before her own, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned the hard way that respect isn't given freely. It has to be earned and maintained. "Tell Jessica that apologies are easy when you're desperate," I replied. Where was her remorse when she was laughing at my expense? Where was her regret when she was scraping my grandmother's recipes into the trash? Marcus tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. "She showed me exactly who she is, son. I'm choosing to believe her." The conversation ended with Marcus promising to call back later, but I knew there was nothing left to discuss. Some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some trust, once shattered, can never be restored. Jessica had made her choice that night in my dining room, and now I was making mine. 2 days later, Margaret called with an opportunity that made my heart race with possibility. The city's annual restaurant week was approaching, and they needed someone to coordinate all the catering for the judges' private tasting sessions. It was a massive undertaking that would put me in direct contact with every major food critic and restaurant owner in the region. The visibility alone would be worth more than the substantial fee they were offering. I accepted immediately, knowing this was exactly the kind of high-profile project that would cement my reputation permanently. Restaurant Week was when the city's culinary elite gathered to celebrate the best of local dining, and the judges' tastings were exclusive events that determined which establishments would receive the coveted awards. Being chosen to cater these sessions was like being handed the keys to the kingdom of professional recognition. The preparation required for Restaurant Week was unlike anything I had tackled since returning to catering. 7 different tasting sessions over 5 days, each one featuring cuisine from a different category of restaurant. Fine dining, casual dining, ethnic cuisine, farm-to-table establishments, dessert specialists, cocktail lounges, and food trucks. Every session needed its own carefully crafted menu that would complement the restaurants being judged without competing with them. I threw myself into the planning with an intensity that surprised even me. This wasn't just another catering job. It was my opportunity to demonstrate my versatility and skill to every person who mattered in the city's food scene. Food critics who could make or break restaurants with a single review would be tasting my creations. Restaurant owners who controlled hiring and reputation in the industry would be experiencing my hospitality firsthand. The menus I designed were masterpieces of balance and creativity. For the fine dining session, I created elegant small plates that showcased classical techniques with modern presentations. The casual dining event featured comfort foods, elevated through superior ingredients and precise execution. The ethnic cuisine, tasting incorporated flavors and spices from around the world, demonstrating my understanding of diverse culinary traditions. Each menu was a love letter to the category it represented, but filtered through my own expertise and vision. The judges would taste not just good food, but exceptional food prepared by someone who understood that every bite was an opportunity to create a lasting impression. This was my chance to show the entire city's culinary establishment what real cooking looked like. The first tasting session was scheduled for Monday evening at the convention center downtown. As I arrived with my team to begin setup, I felt the familiar electricity of a high-stakes event. The critics and judges were arriving in designer suits and elegant dresses, their conversations animated with anticipation for the week ahead. These were people who ate at the finest restaurants regularly, whose palates were educated by years of experiencing the best cuisine the world had to offer. The fine dining tasting went flawlessly. Each small plate was received with the kind of reverent attention that every chef dreams of seeing. Judges took notes between bites, comparing flavors and techniques with the expertise that comes from years of professional evaluation. Several critics approached me directly to compliment specific dishes and ask about my background and training. By Wednesday, word was spreading through the Restaurant Week community about the exceptional catering that was elevating each tasting session. Food bloggers were posting about the incredible small plates they were experiencing. Industry publications were mentioning the superior quality of the hospitality being provided. My name was becoming associated with the event itself, rather than just being a service provider in the background. The ethnic cuisine, tasting on Thursday evening, brought the largest crowd yet, with representatives from every major restaurant and food media outlet in the region. The menu I had designed showcased my understanding of flavors from 6 different culinary traditions, each dish prepared with the kind of authenticity that can only come from years of studying and perfecting techniques. The response was overwhelming, with judges and critics praising both the individual dishes and the cohesive vision that tied them all together. Friday's final session, featuring dessert specialists, was my opportunity to demonstrate the full range of my capabilities. The dessert menu included everything from classical French pastries to modern molecular gastronomy presentations. Each creation was a testament to years of practice and refinement, the kind of technical skill combined with artistic vision that separates true professionals from talented amateurs. As the week concluded, Margaret pulled me aside with news that made my heart soar. 3 major food critics had specifically requested my contact information for future projects. 2 restaurant groups wanted to discuss exclusive catering contracts. The mayor's office had inquired about my availability for an upcoming state dinner. Restaurant Week had been exactly the launching pad I had hoped for, catapulting my reputation to heights I hadn't imagined possible. But the most satisfying moment came on Saturday morning when I opened the city's food magazine to find a full-page feature about Restaurant Week. The article praised the exceptional quality of the judges' tastings, specifically mentioning the superior catering that had elevated each session beyond anything in previous years. My name was prominently featured as the mastermind behind the culinary experiences that had impressed even the city's most discerning food professionals. The phone calls started before 9 in the morning and didn't stop until well past dinner time. Restaurants wanted to book me for their anniversary celebrations. Corporate executives needed catering for board meetings and product launches. Wedding planners were adding me to their preferred vendor lists for clients who demanded the absolute best. I had more work than I could possibly handle, with waiting lists stretching months into the future. Sometimes life has a way of serving justice on a silver platter, and honey, mine came with a side of sweet vindication. Jessica learned that night what happens when you underestimate someone based on assumptions and arrogance. She discovered that the woman whose heritage she had mocked was actually royalty in the very industry where she was now struggling to survive. That $5 tip became a symbol of how completely our positions had reversed, and every successful event I catered afterward was proof that respect isn't about fancy clothes or pretentious friends. It's about skill, dedication, and the wisdom that comes from years of genuine experience.